This is a painting that I made a couple of days ago. Very similar to my last video. I spent about 2 hours outside and then I finished off in the studio. That's my setup and that's my palette. Once again, I'm just using a phone to record all this, so apologies, it's really windy and it's very shaky at the start. Nearly blows my easel over. There you go. But it does get better after a while. I like to try and keep my kit fairly light, and that's one of the drawbacks of having quite a light easel and tripod, is that it tends to blow over in the wind, even with my bag weighing it down. And you can't quite see it in the video, but I'm holding the easel with my left hand now just to try and steady it, which wasn't ideal, but yeah, it worked out all right. And I'm using the sight size method, so I've got my panel at eye level and I'm using my brush to gauge the height of the bolts and the trees. And the view I'm painting here is backlit, so the sun was directly opposite me, my panel's in shade, and everything just looked quite dark to me because the sun was so bright. It doesn't really look like it in the video, but it was like blinding at some points. So I've masked in all the trees in just one simple value first of all, and then I'm keying in the sky. And for plein air painting, I would definitely recommend that you paint with your panel or canvas in the shade rather than in direct sunlight. As for example, if I was facing the other way during this painting and I was, painting the view behind me, the sun would be shining directly on my panel, and that's going to make me paint everything too dark, and all my colours are going to be way too dull. It looks all right while you're outside, but then when you take it home or you hang it in a gallery or something, it's going to look really dark. Whereas when you're painting in the shade, it's much more accurate sort of representation of what you're going to see when you get home. And sometimes it can, for example, it can have the opposite effect. The sun was so bright on this occasion that it was sort of like silhouetting everything, including my panel, and I painted some things, the opposite. I painted them too bright. So when I was massing in these trees, I put in a few sort of like highlights. Some of the more orangey, yellow hues of the trees looked a bit garish when I got back home. So I might knock them back a little bit after this video. One thing with painting objects sitting on water like these narrow boats is it's quite easy to exaggerate the curves or the angle of the boat, especially when you're painting the end of the boat that I am now, where it curves round and it's curved. I do anyway. I tend to paint it slightly too curved, so I'm always trying to remind myself that things like that, usually they're more just of a flat line, to be honest, a level, flat line, level with the horizon. And I have to keep reminding myself to make sure that I don't exaggerate it. a palette knife is really useful. I think it's well worth taking out of you, especially if you know you're going to be painting some man-made objects with a lot of straight lines in. And I do try not to use it unless I really have to, but sometimes it's unavoidable. So when I'm painting this boat, for example, I just want a nice straight line to, for the highlight on the top where the sun's hitting it and stuff. So yeah, I think as well, when you've got a lot of sort of like more natural shapes, the odd sort of really straight line can really set off a painting. It's much better to use it at the start of a painting, or when all the paint's still quite thin on the panel. Whereas if you use it later on when the paint's building up and getting thicker, it's, you're much more likely to smudge your painting, which I do later on in this painting. Use it when the paint's too thick and it smudges it. Also, if you get one with an angle in it, I think it's actually called an angled palette knife, then it's better. It's a lot easier to hold against the panel because the handle is sort of like away from the surface of the painting. I've exaggerated the gap between the sort of the main bolt in the middle and then the bolt on the right because I wanted to avoid having sort of like bolts all the way across the composition. So I've pushed them apart a little bit, and I have exaggerated can't think of the name of it, the little wooden sort of walkway that juts out next to the boat. I like the way the sun was, it was like hitting the water right underneath it, and it's got the shadow, so I exaggerated that, and it juts out a little bit further in my painting. This is one of the bits I find more satisfying when I'm painting water, is putting those little ripples in and the shadows and reflections in the water. I think it gives it a real sense of the boats, as a physical object, like sitting on the water. Once you've put these things in, it starts to come together. At the start, I just masked in these two greyish blue sections on either side of the water, and I used a lot of terps and a lot of medium, so it was really runny and quite thin. So the orange from the panel was showing through, and now I'm using a much more pigmented, slightly darker bluish grey to work into them and put all these ripples in. And I really like the orange showing through from the panel because it gave it a warmth. And I think it worked quite nicely. And then this gap that's running in between, the two dark areas, basically where the sun's hitting the water, I've added a mid-tone first before putting my highlights in, because I wouldn't want to just put the highlights straight onto the panel. I want this sort of mid-tone to fill up most of the gap, and then I am putting in these highlights with, I think it's pretty much just pure titanium white, but with a little bit of yellow ochre mixed in for the warmth. And I couldn't quite get it to pop as much as I wanted while I was out there, so you'll see in a minute when I get it back in the studio, I can get that really sort of brighter value with a bit more control and a bit more time. And this is about the time where I'm ready to pack up because I'm freezing, basically. It was much colder than I expected it to be, and I didn't really bring a proper jacket with me, so I decided to pack up and take it back to the studio. Just before, when I was talking about some of my colours being a bit too bright, a bit too garish, there's a few greens on the left hand side there that are just, a bit brighter than I would have wanted them. But I decided to leave them in because I thought at the time I could see the sun hitting them, and it was quite nice the way the sun was just catching the edges of the trees. But it's a little bit too much. But I left them in. One of the things that I try and leave until later is little things like this, where I'm basically putting in the holes where the sky's poking through the trees. I tend to paint them slightly too bright, and then I need to knock them back afterwards. But if you paint them too bright, they're gonna be a bit too overpowering and gonna draw your eye basically to them, which you don't want. So one thing to avoid is painting them too bright and painting too many as well. Just try and simplify it, which I definitely have painted too many there. So in a minute you'll see I do sort of get rid of a few of them and dull some of them down. I'm just trying to make the sky a bit more interesting here. I remember when I was out there was some really nice sort of subtle clouds and these lines going across the sky, so I'm just using pure titanium white and adding these little clouds in, and because the paint's still wet underneath, it's not too bright because it's picking up the colours underneath. The other thing I'm doing here is I'm trying to soften the tree line, but also include these really fine branches that extend like higher up the tree. And I see people sometimes painting these way too dark, and that's something that can stand out like a sore thumb. So what I'm doing is basically using, I think I take the colour from the sky and the trees. I've basically got a muddy brush, and then I'm just like basically extending them into the the sky, but it's picking up all the titanium white as I'm doing it, and that's what gives you just this like really faint line, which I think looks more like, well, what I want it to look like anyway, is really sort of faint, barely noticeable branches. Try and avoid doing those too dark. I'm just picking out some more of these ripples in the shadow and the reflection of the boat. One thing you can do to give more of a sense of depth and distance is paint the ripples smaller the further away they are. So these ones that are quite far away next to the boat, I'm doing them really thin and sharp, and then the closer the ripples get, you basically just beef them up and use a thicker brush stroke. Another thing I like is putting these little highlights in, like on this boat right now. I think it really, helps to give you a sense of the form of the boat when you show how the sun's just glancing these edges of the railings and stuff. So when I put this little railing in now, you can kind of get a sense of how the boat curves round, and it gives you a sense of the light. I'm just putting in these bolts here that were basically these like black canvas roofs on. I think I painted them slightly too dark, to be honest. I showed my palette at the start. I don't have black on my palette. I just use cad red, ultramarine blue, and then a tiny bit of cad yellow to mix the dark. But yeah, I think I was probably slightly too dark because the boat that's in the foreground was black, and that is lighter than those boats that are in the distance, which isn't great for giving it a sense of depth. They're going to jump out too much, so I am gonna go back and dull those down or lighten them a little bit, just slightly. Another thing that can help to give you a sense of depth is vertical lines like this one. So if you get them right, you know, they push the bolt forward and they push the trees that are behind it back, which gives you that sense of space. And again, I use the palette knife to help me just get one clean, straight-ish line. It's not, you know, it's not perfect, but it'll do. And then the windsock. I always spend too long fiddling about with stuff like this that doesn't really matter. You can see I just keep going back to it. But yeah, once I added that in, I think it gave a sense of depth between the tree and the boat. I tend to avoid putting in lettering like this on signs, or in this case a boat, but yeah, if I do put it in like this one, because I just thought it was too obvious, it was right there, I do just hint at the lettering rather than, you know, actually try and write the word. In this case, the boat was called Gander, so, you know, I'm just hinting. You can see a G, maybe an A, and then the rest of it's just suggested. So yeah, that's the painting pretty much finished. Just adding in a few darker ripples here and there, which I actually thought were a bit too dark. So once I finished the video, I blended some of them in a little bit. But I hope it was helpful to someone out there. And if you like the video, please like and subscribe to this channel, and I'll try and make some more. Check out my website too. Thank you.